Thanks for having me. I don't like hearing myself talk, which is a problem when you give a lot of presentations. So what I'm going to try to do is share some things that I've learned, some of the things that I'm thinking about, and then I would really like you to ask me questions so that I can also hear you talk. Does that sound reasonable? Okay. The title of this talk is What's UX Got to Do with It? And UX means, or stands for user experience. And one of the things I've been obsessed with for a really long time, but didn't have a word for until recently, was the user experience of news, right? As a consumer, but also as a producer of news, how do the ways in which we distribute it, how do the formats in which people read, watch, listen affect their experience of what we're trying to do? And that manifests in a couple of different ways. Historically, when we thought about the user experience of news, all we had to worry about was TV, radio, and print. And we were pretty good at the print thing. We had a couple hundred years of mastering paper as a technology. It was a great technology, didn't need batteries. You know, we got good at designing it, laying it out, how to adjust column widths, how to give a sense of importance by having just one story on the front page, for example, rather than a whole bunch of different ones. We got pretty good at audio. We got amazing at television until cable. We can talk about that separately. But then we came to the internet. And for a long time, putting news on the internet meant a fairly literal translation of, here's a story that we ran into the print edition. We're going to mark it up a little bit with some HTML tags and then slap it on a website that nobody will ever go to. And we didn't do much around thinking about how the form involving a screen would change the way that somebody interacted with that thing. And it was only fairly recently, and mostly coming out of education, that people have started to do research into how the way in which you consume something changes your relationship with the material, right? So are any of you in a class where your teacher has said you're not allowed to have a laptop or a phone? Okay, it's because, not because they hate you, it's because there's a fairly well-researched amount of stuff that screens are more distracting than writing things down are, that you process what you're learning in a different way, that you retain what you're learning in a different way, and that even if I'm not using a screen, the fact that you are distracts me, right? And so we're doing this in education, we have a handle on that, and yet somehow over here, people in news, people in media have gone blithely along, ignoring some of the other kinds of research that are coming out about our changing relationships with the products that we use and that we have. Another question, who sleeps with their phone on and next to them? Me, okay. Who has a wearable device that can receive notifications? Okay. Now, how many of you, the ones who raise your hands for the wearable devices, get annoyed more by your wrist vibrating than by your phone lighting up? Like, what is the bar for your bar for tolerance for notifications on your body is generally lower, right? So text message from a friend that makes your wrist vibrate, still okay. Text message from Facebook saying somebody you don't know shared a post that you don't care about. Not so happy when your wrist vibrates. So the intimacy of our relationship with our devices is also changing how we think about the stuff that we're reading, watching, and listening to. And again, people in news organizations not thinking so much about any of these things, but I think about them all the time. And I think about them in a couple of different contexts. I think about them in terms of workflow. My job has pretty much always been to get people to do things they don't want to do and try to convince them that it's a good idea. That has had mixed success in different newsrooms. But so the thing that I'm extremely alive to is whenever we ask somebody to do a new thing, they have to do that thing on top of what they're already doing. And one of the reasons it's been difficult for newsrooms to adapt to the changing reality of technology and how all of you interact with news, and therefore how all of our audience interact with news, is we already have too much stuff to do. And there isn't enough of us to do it. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is audiences also have too much stuff to do, right? It's not that there is an insufficient number of tabs that you can have open on any given day on the internet. It's not that there isn't always something else to read, or yet another podcast that you feel that you have to listen to, or yet another BuzzFeed video that you really want to watch because everybody else has watched it. There's always something else, and so we are increasingly competing for smaller and smaller slices of your more and more fragmented attention. Problem number two. Problem number three, public enemy number one. We're in a very interesting media environment right now in which, I mean, I wouldn't say that journalism has ever been held up as like the best of all, most trustworthy professions. Nobody liked us the way they liked their family doctors. But it's a really unusual spot to be in, where both our audiences and our potential sources and our subjects expect the absolute least from us, right? So the assumption is that if we write something, it's wrong. If we say we interviewed somebody, we didn't. If we cite a source, we made it up. And so we're operating in a situation of negative trust, right? That we're not even at a baseline of 0, we're like minus 100. And we have to figure out how to get from minus 100 just back to 0. And then we can talk about positive experiences that people have with us. So right now, people don't like us very much. They don't trust us at all. And those messages are being magnified by what they're hearing from people in positions of power and authority. This all sounds great. This is like a super wonderful environment to be doing this kind of research in. You layer on top of this some user experiences that I'm going to talk about, which I broadly categorize into 3 different things. Does anybody here fish? I mean, random, just throwing it out there. OK, who knows what chum is? Has ever heard the term? All right, what's chum? Chum? What's chum?
It's bait.
Bait. Chum is bait, right? Chum is decomposing fish that you throw into the water to get other bigger fish excited. That's what chum is. And the internet equivalent of chum is those like terrible, super misleading ads and headlines that you'll sometimes see at the bottom of a page, which say things like 10 celebrities you didn't know had died, right? This is like the chum of the internet, because you have this immediate reaction of like, ew, or really? And your brain can't help itself, because it's just absolutely designed to capitalize on your most basic emotions. So that's the first thing that we're going to talk about. The second is this idea of trending. Every single social media algorithm, most news organizations, and indeed probably what you're exposed to all the time, has some notion of if something is trending, you should probably know what that is, right? They're like, oh, this hashtag is trending, or have you seen this viral video, or everyone is talking about this, or people are outraged by, right? This notion that if enough people are paying attention to a thing, you should too. And that, much like chum, also capitalizes on your base fear of missing out instinct, right? If everybody else is talking about something, or watching something, or listening to something, you too feel that this is something you need to do, and social media platforms are optimized to make you feel that acutely, and news organizations are starting to do a version of this as well. So chum boxes, trending, and then we have sameness. And by sameness, I mean the fact that over the past couple of years, design conventions in digital have gotten super boring and very similar looking to each other. So stage 1 that you might remember is when we had like the Pinterestization of the internet, and when suddenly everything was a box, right? Like lots of little boxes with, I don't know, belts in them. I'm not on Pinterest, I'm very bad at this. But you looked around the web and suddenly you had this card, it's called a card paradigm, where information was conveyed in cards. And it was very hard to tell which site you were on because everybody had a version of a card. There are some other design conventions that we're starting to see as well, which we're going to talk about. These 3 things are important because they contribute overall to this flattening notion. The idea that there is very little distance between the creators of the news and the consumers of the news. The idea that there's very little distance between different types of news organizations. You cannot tell at a glance if this is necessarily a BuzzFeed story or a New York Times story, a Washington Post story, or a Breitbart story. And there is very little distance between the news happening and you reacting to it, right? So in the olden days, like 5 years ago, if you had an opinion about something on the internet, it would take you more than 45 seconds for you to express that opinion. You couldn't just instantaneously start a Facebook Live video or post a comment or fire off an angry email. You still had to do things like write letters to editors and make phone calls. There was like slightly more time for you to be mad about something and for you to express the fact that you were mad about something. There was slightly more time for a media event to happen in the world and for journalists to be able to report on that, process that, and then publish that, as opposed to getting to a place and immediately starting broadcasting in one medium or another what we're doing. All of these things happening at the same time. This is an equation that I made up. It's not actually maths, don't worry. It's just that I'm at Stanford surrounded by computer scientists, and I feel like I had to throw some maths in there. So this equation is very simple. It says that EQ, which is editorial quality, is a function of audience perception of that editorial quality, which is itself a function of how people are reacting to your design, how they're reacting to your advertising, how they're reacting to how fast your site loads, right? How many of you have given up on loading something because it took more than a second and a half? Yeah, me, constantly. And their previously conceived notions about you. So everything that I've said so far, quality, which is a function of design, it's a function of the advertising experience and how fast something is. None of that matters if you've decided you already hate BuzzFeed, or already love the Washington Post. If you come to something with a strong emotional reaction, you're more likely to forgive advertising, you're more likely to forgive pages that load slowly, or if you've already decided this is a gigantic waste of my time and everyone working there is like either a hippie or a communist or a capitalist, depending on what side of the political spectrum you're on, you're gonna have no tolerance whatsoever for anything that doesn't immediately satisfy you. So, why does this matter? It matters because the three things that I mentioned before around chum boxes, trending, and sameness are all manipulating some element of this equation, right? They're all attempting to get you to either trust us and not trust them, or listen to us and not listen to them, or believe us and not believe them. And by the end of this, I want you to be able to recognize what some of these things are so that you won't be so easily manipulated, one, but also so that in your own work, you can look out for these things and see how you can work against them, right? All I have on my phone are screenshots. I don't have any pets, like, I don't have any children, I don't even take pictures of lattes. All I do is take screenshots of experiences on mobile that drive me crazy. I have hundreds. I had to upgrade my iPhone to put more memory. I had to get the better model because I ran out of space because I had so many screenshots. So here are some from my collection of things that fall into those categories that I mentioned, right? This is the LA Times on the left. Reasonably reputable news organization, but it wouldn't let me read its story. I was trying to read a story in the LA Times, to which I subscribe, by the way. They're like, before you read the story, why don't you check your credit score? I know my credit score, and credit score is excellent. Thank you for asking. I don't want to check my credit score, LA Times. I just really wanted to read this story. Next to it is another site, which is an entertainment site that I was trying to read, and it couldn't decide which ad to give me, so it gave me all of them at once, and you can't even, you don't even know what's going on. It was just that was just a total failure. Washington Post, to which I also subscribe, and I already have an American Express card, right? So double fail. Really, Washington Post, just let me read the story, with which I broadly agree. Wall Street Journal, guess what? I subscribe to that too, right? But before they will let me read this thing, they wanted me to read 3 paragraphs of sponsored content from Deloitte. All right, reasonable editorial decision, I suppose. Again with the Washington Post and the American Express. And then we go to The Guardian, to which I don't subscribe because they won't let you, but they will let you be a member. I went to The Guardian, and I'm reading, and at the bottom of The Guardian's website is a chum box. It's filled with headlines like, 20 couples whose stories make our hearts swell from the AARP. Need a daily dose of style? Watch Style Code Live. It's brought to you by Amazon.com. Something about Tiger Woods' daughter, which I couldn't even get to because first they made me read terrible headlines and then they asked me for money. So, me and The Guardian are having a stressful relationship right now because of this. But there's more though. Back to the Washington Post, which fed me an American Express ad for a product that I already had, then has some paid promoted stories, also known as a chum box, with headlines like, why do pharmacies intentionally make customers wait? I don't know. I also don't care. Bloomberg, which makes several billion dollars a year on its very expensive terminal product, somehow feels the need to also serve me this kind of advertising with headlines like, in Bloomberg fashion, why Warren Buffett spends 80% of his day reading. My hypothesis is he's made more money than God and doesn't need to do anything else. But the reason that I'm showing you this is there's 2 things you should notice, right? Super consistent design convention, cards that look pretty identical on each site. It would be hard without me telling you and without you noticing the URL at the top to know if this was a screenshot from Bloomberg, that one was the Washington Post, or if that was the Guardian and that was Bloomberg, or whatever. So you have lost some of the visual cues that in other mediums like print can clearly signal where you are and what you're doing. And when you lose your visual cues, you lose one of the means of orienting you around how you should treat this. Is this reliable or is this the National Enquirer? What are we dealing with? Okay? So this flattening of design and the fact that these conventions are now everywhere has that effect of disorientation and letting you put your guard down. Because you see this, you get used to this, you think, oh, this must be fine. No problem. What now? This is a screenshot from a BuzzFeed story. BuzzFeed has the best fake news coverage in the business. It's a screenshot from a BuzzFeed story showing a website that is set up entirely to make money from those ads by posting stories that are completely made up, but serving real ads next to them. All right, let me just there was a lot of stuff that I just said there. Let me say that again. This is a website that only exists to get people like you to click on those ads so they make money. Right? That's why they exist. Nothing on this website is real. Everything on this website is designed to make you feel things, rage, despair, whatever, or, depending on how racist you are, oh, that's fine. And then to capitalize on your emotional state, to then encourage you to click on some more stuff and monetize it, right? So, but you can't tell, just from looking at this, that this is not also possibly The Guardian or Bloomberg or The Washington Post, because it's taken all of the design conventions that reputable media organizations are using and is now using them against you to make money. Why does that matter? Because these are real stories. So this is from the bottom of BuzzFeed, right? If you go to a BuzzFeed story, this is how they present. This is what we think you should read next. But these are real stories. These are there's some news in here. There's stuff about Harry Potter, some Drag Race season 9. But it looks kind of like ads and kind of like things that were on the fake news website, but also kind of like things that were on the real news websites. And now you just don't know what's going on. Like, are these ads? If I click on these, do I get a story or does somebody make money that goes to Macedonian teenagers building fake news websites? I don't know. And this is a problem, right? This is a real, genuine, maddening problem because one of the things that you're going to hear a lot over the next couple of months, because it's well-funded at the moment, is people trying to tell you that if we just help people be more media literate, they wouldn't fall for stuff like this. If we can just help people look for cues of what things might be real and what might be fake, they wouldn't fall for stuff like this. I am really, really good at being able to tell what's real and what's fake, and this is still hard for me. Right? I do this for a living. This is one of my areas of research, is mobile user experience. And I was going through some of my screenshots, and I had to check the metadata to be like, is this one of the real websites? Or is this one of the fake ones? I don't know. And I think that is a challenge for our industry, because we have adopted so many of these conventions out of kind of laziness, kind of convenience, kind of everybody else is doing it, and also the reality that those chum boxes I mentioned, which are run by companies like Outbrain, Taboola, they provide a source of revenue for media organizations, right? There was a front page story in the New York Times a couple of months ago about how many millions of dollars those boxes make for publishers. And when you're in an environment in which you're like, oh, I could get money or I could not, I could get money, I can hire some journalists, or I could lay everyone off, you will go for the chum boxes. But when you do that, when you accept that, you set yourself up for being perceived as potentially less credible in an environment in which we already have low levels of trust. Right, so it's a super no-win situation. This is my reminder that now I need to do the scary live demo part of the afternoon and switch to my browser. Oh no. Okay, that actually worked. Hurrah! Is this a real website or a fake news website? Hands up for real. Reputable publisher, probably. You've probably seen the story shared on Facebook. Hands up for definitely not real. Hands up for I have no idea, can't tell. All right. Mostly real, mostly not real, no idea. This is called the Daily Finessa. Yeah, took some headlines there.
Got the temperature in Celsius.
Well, they're based in Canada, so you can't judge them like, on the basis of Celsius, but good observation. All right? What about this one? The Business Standard News. Pretty official looking logo, you know? Got some stuff. Kind of weak picture quality, but you know, there's bylines, right? There's things that look like they could be a news story. There's an embed. We all have embeds now. There's a whole heap load of tags and some obligatory sharing things, right? Real or not real? Are you sure? Real or not real? Real or not real? All right, so confusing, yes? Okay, this one's fake. I mean, it's a real website, but they make stories up. Also fake, also fake, also fake. But it's really hard to tell.
Are any of them responsive?
Most of them are, and on mobile it's even harder to tell. Now I do the scary part of switching back to the thing. Yes, right, that went well. Right, so when people tell me that it's the responsibility of all of you and the responsibility of all of us to make sure that on a screen this small or on a watch with notifications, somebody should instantaneously know if what they're about to read is produced by Macedonian teenagers or the New York Times, I push back. I'm like, you know, there's a Facebook guideline right now. Facebook, in partnership with some other organizations, put out some guidelines around how you can spot fake news. And if you remember all the way back to 2 weeks ago, you may have gotten a notification from Facebook that pops up on every page saying these are the things, they only ran it for 3 days, it's not very helpful. These are the things you should look for. And one of the first things on the list was look at the URL. This is from Facebook, right? This is what happens when you click on an article on Facebook. I would like you to tell me where there is a URL in this story. This is a Facebook article view. Somebody shared a link on Facebook, you tap on it, this is what Facebook pops up. I see no URLs. How am I supposed to check it? I could check it if I were highly, highly motivated, and I am, and I hit share, and then it pops up a share sheet, and then I copy the link, and then I paste that link into Safari, and I look at it. But exactly. So you don't know if it's going to be like a shortened URL. You don't know if Safari now doesn't even show you the whole URL in the bar. So you think it's abc.com, but it's abc.com.af, which is the domain for Afghanistan, but also very cool. And so Facebook is itself trying to get you to change behavior that it has made hard for you to do. Right? Facebook is saying, do this thing, but we're not going to make that easy. But we definitely care about fake news. This is another view of Facebook. So you'll notice up here, this one has no URL bar at all. This one does, but this is not the complete URL, right? This is just the very beginning of it. Because even when Facebook is showing you a URL, it cuts off the rest. And so if you were indeed highly motivated and you copied and pasted, you could see the whole thing. But this doesn't even look like you could tap on it. There's no design. There's no, have any of you read The Design of Everyday Things by Don Norman? Highly recommended. He talks a lot about affordances. An affordance is an indicator that something has an action that you can take. So if you look at that door, you can tell that it wants you to push it, right? It's a very clear signal that you can do a thing. Touch screens like illustrate in certain areas where you should press buttons, laptops, etc. Digital is kind of sucks at affordances. We don't often make it clear whether you should swipe up, down, left, right, whether you should tap. If you've ever found yourself trying to figure out how you close something on your phone, you're like, where's the little X? Or how you stop something from auto-playing. Or how you thought you had your sound off on your phone and somehow this video in class is still making noise and making you look real bad, right? It's because we're not as good at affordances as physical product designers are. So there's no indicator here that even if you wanted to, you could check out that URL. And these are deliberate design decisions. These are things that very, very smart people being paid quite a lot of money sat down and said, this is how we're going to render this. These are things the developers then encoded into the apps that you have on your phones, and they made those decisions for you. But by making those decisions for you, they also decided that they were going to remove your ability to really know the kinds of media, like what is at the root of the media that you are interacting with and that you are consuming, which I have issues with, obviously. Let's talk about push notifications, my favorite subject of all time. I have apps. I have a lot of apps. I have more apps than the average human being, and I have notifications turned on for all of my apps. So my phone is a nightmare, but it's for research, so I tell myself. One of the interesting things about the rise of notifications as a medium and the rise of your home screen as a platform is it suffers from even more acute flattening than anything else, right? Looking at each of these, except unless you're paying very close attention and happen to know that BuzzFeed uses emoji in notifications, you could not really tell where these were coming from, because they are all visually extremely similar, because they all abide by Apple's exceptionally strict design guidelines for how things should look when you are using their operating system. So the four on the left, my left, that one, those are from Apple News. So if you subscribe to Apple News, publishers will send you notifications, and they all look really, really, really similar. If you're paying very close attention, you'll notice a little BuzzFeed logo here and a little Wall Street Journal logo here. But other than that, there's nothing that visually distinguishes National Geographic from Vox, right? These are also all from Apple News, and super samey, right? You start to see that sameness, that loss of distinct visual design that can otherwise situate you in a thing. And if you have an Apple Watch, the amount of information that you get on a watch is even less. If you have an Android wearable device, the amount of information that you get there is even less. So we are making it harder and harder and harder for people to know what they're doing in digital, even as the environment in which we're operating has gotten more and more complex. Did any of you fall for the Google Documents phishing scam today? Ha, all right, I knew there would be at least one person. Sorry for you.
I got that in my inbox today.
But you didn't click. How come?
Because it didn't look like a real Google Doc. It didn't have the normal indicators for being an actual Google Doc. It didn't tell me the name of the document, for instance, which was very suspicious.
So that is a super savvy way of not falling for a phishing scam. But for those of you who didn't know what happened, while you were in class, there was a gigantic meltdown because some reasonably sophisticated, probably dudes, figured out how to get a lot of people to open an attachment or try to open an attachment that looked like a Google Documents attachment. But the second that you did, it would steal all of your contacts out of your contacts book and then email all of them with that sketchy looking attachment, and then wait to see who clicked on it, and then, inception level of people falling for things on the internet. And what it preys on, what these kinds of schemes increasingly prey on, is the fact that if you're just glancing in one of your 17 tabs, you think that kind of looks like a Google Doc, and most of you collaborate on Google Docs, and so it must be fine if you hit this thing, right? And this inattention, the fact that we've gotten so comfortable with this medium and that we're no longer suspicious of it, works against us. When I was a kid, I remember trying to convince my parents to give me their credit card details so I could buy things on Amazon. And they were like, Stacy, under no circumstances, you will get hacked. It took 12 years, but they were totally right. Because now, actually getting your personal information stolen is so trivial. I've had my identity stolen 3 different times. I'm like Experian is on speed dial for me. And I'm like, no, still not me. Still not me. That other person who stole my credit card, that's definitely them. But that doesn't freak us out in the same way that it used to. These things don't freak us out in the same that we used to. We used to get really mad when somebody sent us a notification about something, and now Facebook does it every 5 seconds, and we're completely fine with that, right? Our tolerance for bad digital behavior goes up and up and up. And with that, our levels of suspicion goes down. And it's that suspicion that keeps us on our toes. It's that suspicion that would otherwise make you think, that headline confirms all of my previous thoughts about that person. It's probably made up. That's not how your brains work. Your brain goes, that headline is exactly how I feel about that person. It's definitely true, right? That's called confirmation bias. And if any of you are doing undergrad psychology or anything, you'll spend probably a whole class on that. But these headlines, whether it's the chum boxes, whether it's the fake news websites, prey on your most basic instincts as a person. And you take that combination with everything that I've shown you around the loss of visual cues, around the fact that our reaction time is so much faster. How many of you share things without reading them in full? No, it's all of you. Stop lying. All of you share things without reading them in full. You see a headline that somebody you trust has shared, you by proxy think it's okay, that means you've read it somehow. Because somebody that you know and trust has read that, it must be fine. You hit retweet, you hit repost, whatever it is. Like we have abdicated responsibility for checking things to the platforms, even as the platforms continue to decline to check on our behalfs. And we need to redevelop some of these muscles that we've let atrophy. We need to redevelop a healthy sense of suspicion. You need to be a little bit less trusting of your friends who may not have the world's best passwords, who are definitely not reading articles to the end. When they send you something and you're like on WhatsApp and you're like, where'd this come from? And they're like, oh, it's from cuteanimals.org. You're like, is it really? Are you sure? How do you know? And there is an extent to which we, as future media people in whatever area that comes from, also have to do some of this in our newsrooms. And we have to do some of this in the places that we work. And we have to say, do we really want to rely on chum boxes? Can we make our notifications look a little bit different? Do we need to send 7 of them about the same story? Do we need to, when we are in Facebook instant articles, assume that somebody will know that we made those phone calls that they don't trust us to make? How can we give people more cues, whether it's explicitly by saying we call this source 7 times, or by changing up our visual design so that we don't just look like everybody else, and do a better service to our audiences? Because none of this is easy to solve, right? I'm here just describing a terrible state of things. I haven't made any recommendations for fixing them. None of this is easy to solve, and they are a series of independent problems that have happened to coalesce around this moment, but there's a lot of opportunity to try to fix them. And that's the official part of my spiel. Thank you.
It sounds like what you're saying as we become more and more dependent on screens, which means,
Can you start from the beginning? We've become more and more dependent on screens.
It sounds like as we're becoming more and more dependent on screens, which are visual, we've actually become visually less sophisticated and less complex in how we... or is that such a gross oversimplification that doesn't mean...
I mean, that's what we do, right? We're in media. So I think it's a combination of we have become less discerning, but it's partly because we don't have strong visual vocabularies by default, right? A couple of things that people are bad at, stats and telling when a photo has been manipulated. Generally not natural strengths. And you take that the absence of those kinds of skills with the absence of some of the more explicit cues that we've been able to rely on in print, for example, or on television. In television you can see that a reporter is somewhere. So when they tell you that they're there, they're like, oh yeah, there is a hurricane behind you. You're in Miami, it's fine. We don't have those kinds of signals in the same way in digital. And in addition to the absence of those signals, we have given up some of the ones we used to have. Right? At least if I'm the New York Times and I'm on my website, I can decide I'm going to use the New York Times typefaces. I'm going to have a particular style of headline that is extremely distinctive. If I'm Vox on my website, I have a lot of yellow, a lot of gray. But on something like Facebook Instant Articles or in search, the branding that we can control is much less. Right? So if you use Apple News, you will notice that things look more similar than if you were to open a tab with those same stories on the NewYorkTimes.com and WashingtonPost.com, because Apple is controlling the environment in which that happens, and Apple has guidelines around how things have to look. So they say, okay, you can do whatever you want in this box. This is your box. Your box can look slightly different from that other box, but you both have boxes of the same size. And that I think is a challenge for us. Anybody else? Microphone? Just one? Mike. To make our camera person happy.
Okay. Hi. You mentioned that BuzzFeed right now has the best fake news coverage.
Coverage, yes.
Right. Fake news coverage in the business. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. There's a fantastic human being named Craig Silverman, who is based in Toronto and was our Canada editor. And then we remembered that when we hired Craig, he used to run this website called emergent.info and another one called Regret the Error. And Regret the Error was a way he used to classify all corrections in newspapers. This was a long time ago when newspapers issued corrections in the bottom of stories that they didn't want you to see. And so Craig has been obsessed with figuring out, how news organizations get things wrong. But it used to be that it was just that news organizations were getting things wrong and not that fake news organizations were making things up. But he has a team now of people who do things like debunk stuff in real time. So let's say there's a mass shooting, or there's an attack on a European capital, or there's a natural disaster. These are times that if you spend more than 5 minutes on Facebook and Twitter, you will start to see things that are probably not true being spread. Like, there's a second shooter, almost never a second shooter. Or there were 22 people who've been confirmed killed, and then 5 minutes later it was like, maybe it was 2. We don't know. Or there's a shark swimming in the subway. No. You know, like, people use these opportunities in which there's not a lot of confirmed information, but there's a lot of appetite for updates, right? Going back to this, you now expect that if something happens in the world, 30 seconds after you find out about it, you can find out more. That is a very unusual thing. It is unprecedented in history. You used to have to wait weeks to find out about things that happen in the world. Now you're like, why is nobody talking about this on Twitter yet? I just got a notification, you know, right? So like, your time span is aggressively compressed. And media organizations are under a lot of pressure to try to deliver to you updates. And in that environment, we make more mistakes, but then you will see somebody else who seems to know what they're talking about. They're like, oh, here's a massive picture of a protest that's happening down my street in wherever, and it's in Venezuela. You know, but it's hard for you to tell. So that, I think, has definitely been something that's happening. And what Craig and his team do is, because BuzzFeed has such, well, they're really good at the internet, but you know, they also know how to use social. They will put up a picture and be like, this, fake, giant yellow letters, fake. This, unconfirmed. You know, so using the same tools that people are using to spread misinformation to try to correct what's happening out there. It is a thankless task, and if you ever see him, like, buy him coffee or something. Or something hotter if you're over 21. Okay. Who else has a question? Hey.
So you talk about like this mobile experience, and it's relevant because I guess we all have that on our phones, but technology is growing so quickly that in the next second something new will come up and that changes the user experience completely. So as content creators, you're going out there and you have to sort of keep up with what's happening in technology. And so I'm wondering, how do you keep your ethics and thinking about this idea of fake news going when technology in itself is changing all the time?
I don't see those things as mutually exclusive. I only started thinking, I mean, it's not that I started thinking about fake news, it's that I started thinking about why are all these websites so bad? And that led me down the path of why are these ads so terrible? And then like, who are these Macedonian teenagers? You know, it was just a layer of things after another. So there's two questions in there. There's, what do we do when we know the technology is changing faster than we can keep up with it? And the answer to that is try really hard and convince your editors to give you a gadget budget. So you can, you know, so I have a PC, I have a laptop, a Mac laptop, I have an Android phone, no, I have an iOS phone and an Android tablet, I have an Alexa and I have a Google Home, and I have a really good accountant who helps me write all of those things off as business expenses because it would otherwise be very expensive. But I try to, whatever my primary device is, I try to get to switch to an environment in which I'm uncomfortable, right? So I do not like Windows. The last time I used Windows was as a teenager, but I bought a Windows laptop because Microsoft has been shipping more and more stuff. PCs are gaining market share again. That means an increasing base of potential audience is going to be, you know, interacting with news on Windows devices. I need to know what they're offering and how they're doing it. And also, I'd forgotten how to use one. So I'm there like, how do I take a screenshot? And I had to relearn. And in that process of relearning, I became more suspicious because everything was hard, right? And another thing that happens to your brain is when you're under stress, or when you're angry, or when you're hungry, for example, you're more judgmental, right? You're more likely to interpret something as negative rather than positive, and that works in my favor. I don't like being stressed all the time, so then I switch back to my Mac and everything's good. But it is helpful for me to kind of switch those environments up, and it's helpful for us. The second we get comfortable with the technology, we should use something that we're not comfortable with, right? So if you spend all of your time on Instagram and on Snapchat, switch. If you spend most of your time on Facebook and on Twitter, switch, and make it a deliberate thing that you do so that you're always in an environment in which you are not the expert. And so that helps you have more empathy for your audiences, right? One of the things that is challenging in newsrooms is we tend to do our stuff on the best equipment that we can afford at the time, which is not always the best equipment, but we have access to Ethernet. We might have, you know, bigger monitors, slightly more expensive cameras that can, you know, we can handle raw files. But then the person on the other end might be on an Android device with limited data. And we haven't thought about how our super beautiful high resolution production is going to render for that person on the other end. So I try to, step out of my like cushy Mac laptop life and think about if I didn't have access to this, but I still wanted somebody to read it, watch it, or listen to it, how would I do this differently? What else? And read fiction. Dystopian fiction is really good at giving you a sense of like what other technology might happen that might not end well. Okay.
Hi. So in a time when well-established news organizations like the New York Times, for example, are being called fake news, how do you think we can put like the trust back in those reliable sources, whether that's through technology or what are your thoughts on that?
So let's say we solved all those problems there around like flatness and sameness and chum boxes, and we got back up from minus 100 to 0, and then we had to go from 0 to 100. What are some of the things we could do? We could think about why are people mad at us? Legitimately, why are people mad at us? One of the reasons that we hear often, which some of you are talking in your classes, is people feel like they do not see themselves in media, right? That the people on air, that the sources that we cite, that the places that we are based and that we go to, that the communities that we cover are not actually represented in our newsrooms, in our stories, in our videos. And if we were to think for more than 5 minutes about why that might be, and what some of the things are that we can do to appear and to actually be more representative, that would go a long way. If you ask people of all media what are the ones they trust the most, they will almost inevitably cite the name of their local morning news person, right? Somebody who they see, who wakes up with them, who then like cuts to the weather and tells them what they need to wear that day. That is like they have a relationship with this person. It's the opposite of sameness. It's like I know what this person looks like, I know her name, I might even know something about her family, whatever. It's the opposite of sameness, and they identify with that person. As local news gets cut more and more, those kinds of relationships, are being actively undermined, and people feel even less connected to whatever the hell the New York Times is doing. They're in New York, I'm not in New York, why should I care? The Washington Post has Washington, D.C. in the name. So how do we figure out within our newsrooms what we can do to have better outreach to the people who currently don't feel represented in our newsrooms? That's one. Another thing which news organizations have finally started doing is being acutely aware of the fact that if most of you are not reading stories to the end before you share them, nobody is, right? If people at a journalism school are not reading stories on the internet before they share them, absolutely nobody else out there is. So we need to rethink what I call the atomic unit of news delivery. Like, what is the smallest possible thing that can convey the story? And often on social, it's the headline and the image. So if your headline is misleading, if your headline does not sufficiently tell the story, or if your image is misleading, if you get the wrong Jimmy, for example, in your slate, and you wanted to write a story about Jimmy Kimmel, but your image is of Jimmy Fallon, not ideal. If that's the only thing that somebody sees in their stream, how can we do those better? How can we write better headlines? How can we serve better images? That's two. The third thing is if people are in fact reading the story, watching the video, listening to the podcast, how can we tell them more about how we know this thing to be true, right? Instead of just saying sources said. Stop relying on anonymous sources where that's possible. Give people some context. We called them for comment. Did they return the call? Did they not return the call? This sounds like boring reporting 101 stuff that nobody else is going to care about. And even if nobody emails you and thanks you for telling you how many sources you've given them, what you're doing is showing that you did the work. I tend to think about journalism as a series of skills, right? And a series of processes that we do to get to produce the stuff that we're producing in whatever medium that is. And those skills are largely invisible, right? People see the front end of the story, they see the finished video, they listen to the podcast, and they have no idea how messy everything on the back end was. They don't see the notebooks, and you should never show them your notebooks. They don't see the reels, they don't see all the different versions, they only see this thing, and they're like, I spoke to you for 2 hours, and you ran with one sentence of my quote. What the hell? We don't do a particularly good job of helping people understand what goes into creating those things. And it's something we can do. As we are cultivating our sources, for example, we can help educate them. If you have the opportunity, I follow a lot of librarians on Twitter. They're very entertaining. But one of the things that librarians are really working on is using the fact that libraries are generally the most trusted institutions in a community. right? They serve as a gathering place, as an information point, and people trust their librarians because you have no reason not to. Librarians in pop culture are always awesome, right? Media and pop culture, not so much. There's no evil librarian in House of Cards. So librarians have been doing all of this outreach to journalists and saying things like, hey, come hang out and talk to us and like meet the community. And journalists are like, nah, too busy, gotta write some stories, nobody's gonna read. You know? So we have this incentive matching problem where when we are given the opportunity to do that community outreach, we see it as less important than the stuff that we're doing every day. And there's always a tension between the urgent thing and the important thing. And one of the things we need to start thinking more about is the important thing, and not just the urgent thing. So.
Time for one more.
Mike.
So personally, do you think advertising should be allowed in the news?
Do you like having a job? Here's my thing about advertising. Until we find another way to convince people to pay for journalism, it's going to be around. It's going to be around in one form or another. And what you have here is another incentive mismatch, right? Advertising on mobile is a particularly garbage experience because publishers need to guarantee that you saw the ad, right? If I am American Express, I will give you a certain amount of money, but you have to promise me that Stacy saw that ad. And the way they do that is by making it the first thing on the page, or you can't scroll past it, or they hide the X to close the box. Because they've signed a contract, and they want to continue paying journalists, and so they piss off the audience that they need in order to do that. So it's a really weird way of funding your business. It's taken a while for media organizations to realize that pissing off your audience is not sustainable long term. And so we're at a stage now where, because ad blockers have really picked up, and that ad blockers are beginning to be big on mobile, publishers are starting to realize that they will get to a point very soon where they lose more revenue from ad blockers than they gain from having terrible advertising experiences. And then you will have a market correction. And I'm looking forward to that day, because I'm really tired of being served American Express ads. The other thing about advertising is in general, we need advertising to make decisions, right? And this is going to be like music to the ears of people in marketing, but it is a very complicated world. There's a lot of stuff I could potentially buy. Tell me what I should buy. Basic function of marketing and advertising. And there are entire products built around advertising. You know, if you read fashion magazines, 1% editorial, 99% advertising. That magazine exists to tell you what's in style right now. If you read beauty product placement, it's the same thing. I read a lot of magazines about bicycling because all I want to do is buy bikes. I can't buy any more bikes, I'm out of space, but I'll still read the magazines and be advertised too, because that makes me happy. So I don't want advertising to not exist in media. I want it to exist in a way that doesn't undermine the editorial proposition. And that, I think, is where we've lost the plot. We have gotten to a point where the advertising is so intrusive that, you know, the journalism is second. They're not even at the same level.